Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Tania Hope. I am the director of the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University. Thank you all very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation as daughter of a Liberian woman. I've been growing up with the narrative of Africa as this amazing place, not the narrative that I think many of us have grown up with. So I'm happy to be a part of continuing that conversation. And I'm happy to be doing it with such an esteemed panel. The biographies, their profiles are on the website, so we're not gonna spend time doing deep introductions. I'll maybe ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll just jump right into this conversation because we don't have a lot of time. Deniece?
Sure, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Deniece Laurent-Mantey, the Executive Director of the President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement. Thank you.
My name is Melvin Foote. I'm the President and CEO of the Constituency for Africa. Been working on Africa for more than 40 years. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Worku Gachou. I lead Visa's inclusive impact and sustainability work in North America. I've spent a long part of my career focused on Africa issues. I'm currently an adjunct at Georgetown and a global fellow at the Wilson Center as well.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We're just going to jump right into it because we got a lot of things to cover in 45 minutes. So, first question. This is for everybody. How can we effectively educate Americans about the importance of Africa? And what role does the diaspora play, ideally, in this effort?
You're all looking at me like...
You just set up the advisory council.
Oh my God. Everyone literally turned to me. Okay, well, I'll kick it off. The advisory council that the president signed an executive order for in December was just launched about 2 months ago. And I think the importance of the Diaspora Advisory Council, one, is to show that we're in an era where, Africa's diaspora can truly play a role in our U.S. Africa policy. And so I think to the question, how can we really educate or just spread knowledge about Africa, I think we have a source of strength in our diaspora. With the youthquake on the continent, with the millions of African immigrants, African Americans who live across the Atlantic Ocean, we have a major opportunity to be a part of Africa's sustainable development. And so the council is a group of 12 members, across different sectors, to really educate, the diaspora, but also strengthen ties with our partners on the continent, whether it's through the creative industries sector, trade and investment, arts, sports, diplomacy, democracy, and governance. I think we have an opportunity to really hone in on our diaspora as a source of strength when it comes to our Africa policy. There's also one thing that I always say, particularly, I know Ambassador Rama mentioned the youth bulge on the continent, as we like to call the youthquake on the continent. And I think one of the key things that's happening on the continent right now is that the currency of this generation on the continent is Africa's innovation. Hence, the theme for this conference is Africa's creativity, Africa's innovation. And with the diaspora, we have an opportunity to really tap into that and strengthen that. And so whether it's the diaspora investing on the continent through entrepreneurship, whether it's transferring knowledge to the continent but back to the United States, whether it's through remittances, we have a major opportunity to really strengthen the development of the continent by leveraging, I think, the expertise of our African diaspora.
I want to add to that. I've always felt that, the U.S., by and large, we say we want to work with Africa, but by and large, Americans are uneducated, undereducated, or miseducated about Africa, period. So there need to be an effort, certainly need to be funded to educate Americans. You could do town hall meetings, you could do civic and social programs. There's all kinds of ways of engaging Americans about Africa. And this is really what the Constituency for Africa has been doing since inception. We've been moving around the country and trying to mobilize people. Using information technology now, we can reach people in ways that we could never do before COVID. Before COVID, we didn't have Zoom and we didn't have these technologies that can be employed. We also got to figure out ways to bridge the gap. The biggest African diaspora in the United States are people like myself, My people came here 300, 400 years ago by forced migration, slavery, you know. And, you know, our names have been taken, our culture has been stolen. We've been totally disconnected from Africa. So now as we try to come together, we don't know if we're Ghana. I know I'm Ivorian, Ghanaian, and Nigerian. But most African Americans do not know where they originate from in Africa. And so we no longer can identify with Nigeria or from Liberia or a specific country. So we identify with the whole continent, you know. So when you think about the most Pan-African Africans in the world, it's African Americans. We love all Africans from Cape Town to Cairo. And so there need to be efforts to really engage. Some of this gets into issues that we don't want to talk about, like reparations, and we do need to talk about reparations. We got to repair the damage. And so part of this is to get Africans, help Africans to unite and connect. Another part of this is to help Americans understand. It's not just black people who are from Africa. All of us are from Africa. You know, everybody here in this room, believe it or not, you descended from an ancestor in Africa. So part of this has got to be a real strategic strategy to engage Americans, to change how we transform. How are we going to compete with China or Russia and other countries if Americans don't get why we engaged in Africa? So I'll throw it to Worku to clean it up.
I mean, Mel and Deniece were quite eloquent about the importance of engaging Diaspora to help strengthen U.S.-Africa ties. I'm going to be a little bit more trite with my commentary, saying that, you know, money talks, and that's how you really try to influence policy and education here in the U.S. is making sure people here understand the economic opportunity and the growth potential for your commercial enterprises on the continent, right? So you talk about the youthquake, right? You know, how it's being described in some of the corporate boardrooms is that's purchasing power increase, right? So as we look at that population and their growing economic livelihoods, right? You know, understanding and packaging up that opportunity clearly for the U.S. markets and using the diaspora to help make that connection, I think will be key in strengthening those ties.
Great, so let's stay on that. Let's keep it going in that direction. And let's talk about maybe what are some of the key ways in which the private sector, but also the public and civil society sectors are engaging with the diaspora in Africa? And what can they be doing better or more of to advance the interests of the diaspora?
If you look, you know, I have a unique position where currently I'm focused on the U.S. and Canadian markets, but I've spent a majority of my career focused on Africa trade and investment. And there's this mindset that it is the U.S., it is the developed world that will be sharing and exporting ideas and technology to the developing world. I actually think it's the inverse. I think when you look at the innovation, when you look at some of the technology advances on the continent, right, that is what should be exported. That is what's currently being exported externally. And so really capturing that story, right? Let me give you one example is Zipline. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Zipline, but they are a drone manufacturing company. And they set up their manufacturing and they set up their logistics hub, their first logistics hub in Rwanda. And it was to test blood delivery via drones in austere environments. Successful in Rwanda, expanded throughout the continent, right? Technology that was developed, that was improved. Now, for the first time, their drone technology 2 years ago was used to deliver COVID vaccines in North Carolina, right? So this is technology that's being developed in Africa that's being utilized here in the US. And then when you look at some of our technology leaders here in the US, I mean, they're African diaspora. The CEO of Calendly, Tope, if you look at Isuzu, it's a credit building platform for individuals paying rent. Is developed, the CEO is a Nigerian gentleman. When you look at Chipper, a cash movement app, that's another African diaspora CEO. So African diaspora in the US are leading some of the biggest technology advances. Harnessing that, right, will be key in building that bridge between the US and the continent, I believe.
And just to add to that topic, I talked about the currency of this generation being, innovation and creativity and ingenuity. And I think Worku did a good job talking to that. One example I'll give is that some of the major fintech companies, literally started in Kenya. Started in East Africa, but sometimes they don't have the opportunities to distribute some of their creativity across the continent. And so when we harness the talent of the diaspora and expand opportunities, we can strengthen those ties both ways. And so whether it's the technology that's coming from the continent to the United States and then vice versa, and then they can, I think, strengthen opportunities to expand their partnership and then also expand their creativity for the global market. I think we're in an inflection point where we're not just talking about what we're going to do in Africa, but what we're going to do with Africa. And so what we're doing with Africa to achieve global objectives is our focus right now. And there's so much creativity, there's so much innovation, with the youth on the continent that can truly help, I think, the economic development of the continent writ large.
I would say, I just came back 2 weeks ago from a trade mission to Bamako, Mali. And it was against the wishes of my government, who told me that security is a concern in Mali. The only security concern I saw was these motorbikes all over the place in Bamako. And I would not advise walking in Bamako. But I would say that the diaspora, this was a diaspora trade mission. We spent a lot of time with the U.S. ambassador on the ground. We spent a lot of time with private sector entrepreneurs, and it was a people-to-people engagement. You got African diaspora talking to Africans in Mali. To me, it's the perfect way for us to segment into getting into Africa. The diaspora is your best lead. You want to talk to Africa. You got all these Africans in the United States right now who can easily get on the phone, can easily access their countries, but we're not using them. We're not making use of them in appropriate ways. We also need to get more young people into the U.S. Peace Corps. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer. We need to get more young people engaged early in the process. We need to be doing all kinds of things in the schools and other ways to get young people to think of Africa. When I first went to Africa, I really thought Tarzan would be at the airport. I really thought. I went to Ethiopia. They told me I'm going to Ethiopia, and I'm from the Bible. I thought Ethiopia was in the Middle East. I didn't know it was. You couldn't Google back then. So we got a big job to transform how Americans view Africa, period. And we got to fully engage the African diaspora. This is our best lead. We can beat China if we use our diaspora. But if we don't use the diaspora, we don't have a chance.
Mel, what year was that trip?
73.
Okay.
Wow.
73.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Just to touch on a really important point you made about the people-to-people diplomacy, and then also the China angle as well. I think investing in programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative and really thinking about how do we get Africans also exposed to possibilities here in the U.S. I think one of the troubling stats that I personally have seen recently is the amount, how was it framed? It was Africans going to Russia and China for higher education now, higher for the first time ever in history than the United States, which is troubling for me. When you start building those relationships at that young of an age, right, that's how you build that commonality, that's how you build those bonds that Mel's talking about. So ensuring that we are providing Africans the opportunity to come learn and engage with U.S. leaders, with U.S. businesses, with U.S. civil society like Mel will be key.
So our YALI program is a great program on the topic of education. When we bring, we literally bring African leaders to the United States. They're at different universities, they go through different training programs, et cetera. But another thing that I know the council we're working on is to also, I think, leverage something like a reverse YALI. I think getting African Americans and, I think diaspora students to the continent as well, right? And so in order to leverage both partnerships, right, having African students come here, African Americans go to Africa, I think is also key. And that also helps with the education element and the knowledge transfer as well.
Where do I sign up?
Coming very soon.
Okay.
You're speaking my language now because one of the things that we do at the Bunch Center is administer most of the study abroad for Howard University students.
Yeah.
And a little some data that I will just drop here and I'll leave it here. HBCU students disproportionately prefer to go to places other than Western Europe when studying abroad. And of the African American students who do study abroad in the United States, of which it is very low, I'm talking about less than 5% at this point, of the African American students that do study abroad, 97% of them are coming from historically black colleges and universities. And so our students prefer to go to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It's not rocket science, but the numbers are still low, and so we must do a better job getting them
We need more opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. We did host YALI students at Howard as well, though, and so we had a great opportunity to have them engage with our professors, our students, folks like Mel, etc. So Mel apparently is a very good storyteller. I think most of us know this. So Mel, what are some of the undertold stories with regard to how the diaspora interacts with the continent, and how diaspora voices are driving innovation and adaptation in Africa? What should people be more aware of with regard to this demographic?
Well, I think historically, their forces here, even during slavery, they didn't want the slaves to think about going home. So they took away the drums, they took away the culture, they made us Negroes, if you will. This is what we're up against. But have we transformed that? Have we really turned it around to try to make it work for us as opposed to against us? I think we have a lot of work to be done in that category. I'm also thinking about the U.S. African Diplomatic Corps. How many Africans diaspora do we have as ambassadors? I would be surprised if there's more than 4 or 5. And we're talking about now we got the Biden administration, which is supportive of a lot of the things we're doing. But you go back to the Trump administration, it hasn't changed very much. And so there's still a mindset here that we haven't really transit. Now, there's all kinds of people who are, I personally think YALI is the best program ever from the U.S. government side. And I take a little bit of the credit on that. I ain't gonna take all of it, I'll take a little bit. But I think what YALI has done is not only got a young person from Senegal to the United States, but they also met their colleagues in Ethiopia and Swaziland and other parts. So all of a sudden now with technology, Africans are talking to Africans, and it's going to have a profound impact on the African Continental Free Trade Area, as Dr. Amina talked about. And I think also we have potential to start businesses. We should be really looking to do a lot of this next generation entrepreneurship, which requires a lot of technology. You could physically be sitting in New York or Chicago or Nigeria or anywhere else and communicate on a daily basis. We have to really expand on that, getting more young people to meet each other. For me to do my business, I need to have somebody in Nigeria working. I'm working on my book. I'm going to write a book. I'm thinking about a ghostwriter who's sitting in Nigeria. You know, these Nigerians, they could write like you wouldn't believe, you know? So why should I sit here? You got Chinua Achebe type sitting over there in Nigeria using Google using, the technology. You can actually get a book written over there and never have met the person. That's how I'm going to get my PhD. But I see all kinds of opportunities galore. But we have to fully engage the human and the United States should be driving this. You know, our uptick is technology. You know, we should be driving this. It should not be even left to be thought about. I would say that we need to transform U.S. policy toward Africa to really to focus on technology engagement. We need a new program called Tech Africa. That's the bumper sticker.
Well, speaking of policy, we actually launched an initiative called Digital Transformation with Africa in December during the Africa Leaders Summit. And I think the importance of that was to really harness the digital boom that's happening on the continent right now. And so it's focused on 3 pillars. One is, human capacity development, emerging technologies, and to also focus on the enabling environment. And so we did launch an initiative, Mel, in December at the Africa Leaders Summit. And I think it has truly made lots of inroads in ensuring that we're training, Africans in this space and harnessing their talent. But as you rightfully said, the U.S. is a leader in digital technology, and so we should be taking advantage of that when it comes to our policy as well.
I mean, just doubling down on that point, I think what the U.S. exports the best and what we're known for, I think, globally, is innovation and entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. When you look at some of the countries that Mel's mentioned, Russia, China, elsewhere, right, you don't have that drive, that strive around entrepreneurship and innovation. And so that desire is there on the continent, right? When I think McKinsey issued a study last week, there's about 5,000 or so different startups starting up every year, right? Africans love the hustle. They love the idea of going out there, building something on their own. And so being able to harness that kind of unique aspect of U.S. culture, I think will be key in bridging that U.S.-Africa divide.
Any undertold stories?
I think that is one piece, the innovation entrepreneurship. I kind of mentioned it earlier as well. I think the number of African diaspora leading large technology companies here in the U.S., from the startup to kind of Series B, Series C stages, also not shared enough. I mean, that's a really proud story.
Another area I think I want to focus on also is the creative industry sector. And so arts, music, film, storytelling, fashion, and sports. It's a sector that we see is growing expansively, and the U.S. market has not, has I think taken notice of it, right? So you have the Netflix, the Apple Music, et cetera, really investing in this space. Africans are great storytellers, and for me, I look at Nollywood and I look at the pace at which Nollywood is really moving, and the amount of quality content that is coming from the continent to really, all over the world, I think is amazing. And the creativity in Nigeria alone, which is the most populous country, is I think astonishing. And so the creative industry sector does something amazing because it shares stories. And I always say storytelling will always, I think, do a better job than foreign policy, because people connect to it, people relate to it. And so we're now taking leverage of how can we create a hub of the creative industry sector with our foreign policy and truly leverage that. You hear Afro beats when you walk into your regular retail store in the United States, right? Whether it's in New York City or whether it's in Houston or whether it's in Kansas, Afro beats is all over the place. And so we have to also look at that sector. And one, the U.S. should, I think, do a better job in harnessing the creativity coming out of the continent and creating more collaborations and partnerships, which we are doing, right? And to also help with the intellectual property, right, of the content coming out of the continent, right? So that, one, Africans can take ownership of those stories, take ownership of the content, while we also support the distribution of that creativity.
In 2021, I went to, I traveled with Ambassador Robert Yard to Dakar for the African Basketball Association, BAL, in Dakar, and it was the second season of it. There was a time when we had Manute Bol was representing Africa. Here's this guy, 7 feet 6 inches tall. Everybody, wow, he was a unique thing. But look at the National Basketball Association today, and you see the talent coming from Africa. And now, the National Basketball Association has taken notice. They opened up an office in Nairobi last week. Mm-hmm. And the talent in Africa is absolutely immense. And you see how sports is really being transformed in Africa. There was a time the only sport that we talked about was soccer. Now you're talking about basketball, you're talking about football. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of Africans who are looking this way. And I think that the U.S. has taken note because they're looking for another Giannis, the Greek freak in Milwaukee. They're looking at Joel Embiid in Philadelphia, and they're seeing all of this tremendous talent. But I think that's another area that we can really, not only in terms of sports, we're seeing all of the music being transformed and added to it. We're seeing all of this creative industry. We're looking at African foods now that are spring. The youth bulge is what you're seeing in Africa. And, you're looking at why the West African countries are throwing the French out and holding these coups. It really is because the youth have risen up. These kids who were 8, 10 years old now are in their 30s, And they no longer are going to accept the old way of doing things. So we as a country have got to also respect that. We can't just get mad at them because they had a coup. They had a good reason to have a coup. I'm wondering when is the next coup in Cameroon? When is the next coup in Equatorial Guinea? Where is Uganda? Where is Congo Brazzaville? We got to stop thinking that the only tool we have in the toolkit is a sledgehammer, and we got to start understanding and listening to the people. But the young people who are going to rule the world, they're going to rule the world over here. That's why I back off of a lot of this stuff, because the 30s and 40s are now taking over, and we got to be respectful of that and being supportive. But in Africa, it's taking a total big overturn. The African, like I said, is going to be 1 out of 4 people in the world are going to be African. And so we have to also make some adjustment as to how we're looking at Africa and how we partner with Africa.
Just to Denice's point about the creative industry, which I don't think should go unsaid, is one of the ways to gauge cultural impact and influence that I look at is lineups at arenas and concert stages. If you look over the past 2-3 years at Capital One Arena down the street, the Anthem, the 930 Club, the only Diaspora-focused events being held were Latin, reggaeton, etc. Now, if you look at their lineups, Burner Boy, WizKid, a significant amount of African artists being put on lineups, and the shows are being sold out, right? And the people attending them are not only African diaspora, right? It is a broader swath of the population. So that's just a great barometer to see the impact and influence of African culture in the creative industry here in the U.S. That for me is super exciting.
It's overdue.
Overdue as well. Overdue as
And
well.
that's something that we didn't already know. It's just everybody else was just trying to catch up with us.
Yeah.
That's true.
We already knew these things. So we talk about the diaspora, and most of the conversation has been focused on the diaspora in this country. But there's also a larger diaspora in Latin America. We don't often talk about it. So maybe what are some of the conventional modes of thinking about the diaspora that we've already talked about, but who's being left out of that? And how are the diaspora voices in Latin America and the Caribbean and other places contributing to the conversation around the continent's future?
I went to Cuba in July, and I always wanted to go to Cuba, and I wanted to see the African diaspora in Cuba, and I was amazed. You fly from Fort Lauderdale, as soon as you get into the air, they tell you, okay, buckle your seatbelt, we landed. It's like flying to Baltimore, And then, you start to look at the people. You're absolutely right. You go to places like Guyana, you go to, there are more Africans in that part of the world than up here. But because they speak Spanish and they speak Portuguese and other languages, we have basically don't know they even exist. And I think media plays a big part of this. There are people, like I saw this week, where the U.S. government's getting ready to have some war games in Guyana and Venezuela over this oil, Gee whiz, I mean, you got 40% of the population of Guyana who are black. They came by the same slave ships that brought me here. They just got off there. They got off in Brazil, but they're the same people, We have a lot of work to do to connect the diaspora. I think technology, again, is one vehicle that we could be using. Like I said, you can have a Zoom meeting right now, have somebody from Brazil and have somebody. So we're trying to make those kind of inroads, and we're trying to make those kind of connections. The Caribbean is much more, at least informed about a lot of this stuff. But when you go to South America, you're part of the diaspora. We have a lot of work to do to make some of these connections with Colombia and Venezuela and elsewhere throughout South America.
I agree, and I think we have a lot of work to do on, strengthening those ties with the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, whether it's in, Guyana, et cetera. And I think, as Mel said, technology can certainly help with that, to help strengthen those collaboration, those ties between the diaspora. We've come a long way with even just, uniting the the expanded version of the diaspora, which is African immigrants and African Americans in the United States, and that is still an ongoing effort. And so we have a lot of work to do to, I think, expand that effort, across the different continents as well.
I'll kind of flip that question. For me, what I look at is, what are some of the other diaspora groups doing in the U.S. that the African diaspora groups are missing out on, right? And so one of the things I see is a real gap in political organizing. When you look at what Indian diaspora groups, what Latin diaspora groups are doing here in the U.S., they are organizing, irrespective of Republican or Democrat, as political entities, using their strength in numbers, their strength with their dollars, their fundraising dollars, their campaign contributions, and are really influencing U.S. policy to advantage their respective diaspora groups. It's a playbook that we see a number of different institutions doing, but we are not seeing it well executed within the African diaspora groups. There's organizations like the Asian American Hotels Owner Association. There's Unitas US. I mean, these are really influential political advocacy groups that are advocating for the interests of those diaspora groups here in Washington. And so I think that's an area where, as me as an African diaspora here in the US, right, it's something that I think about. How can we use our collective strength in numbers? I mean, there are 5 million African diaspora individuals currently in the U.S., right, Deniece?
That is correct.
Right, and so if you take out the European diaspora groups in the U.S., it's one of the highest segments, right? And so collectively as a whole, it could be a really influential force here in Washington.
I want to add to that, Canada. We also have a diaspora north of our border. And we work with them. You'll find all kinds of Africans. A lot of the former slaves left the U.S. and actually went to Halifax. And there's a whole community there. But there's a whole slew of very talented Africans I work with. I took one of them with me to Mali on the trade mission, the Africa Trade Desk in Ottawa. But you got Afro Global TV in Toronto, which to me is one of the most powerful diaspora media networks, par none. And we have to also increasingly reach out. We do a lot of programming directly with Canada, the Canada diaspora. We're meeting with the president of Namibia in February virtually. And so I got Canada coming, I got some Caribbean coming, and I'm going to try to reach Colombia. I'm going to talk to you about that. But we ought to be doing more. We, as a diaspora, have to also engage the diaspora. We can't expect others to do it if we don't do it. And so I'm hoping coming out of this, we can look at some new kinds of collaborations throughout the Western Hemisphere.
So we don't have enough time for this conversation, but I just wanted to, you were mostly talking about recent diaspora, and you, Mel, are talking about the diaspora much more broadly, yes?
Recent diaspora,
like African immigrants who've come recently.
Yes. Sorry, excuse me.
But Mel, you're talking about the diaspora, those who came way before that.
Historically.
So I think one of the issues is the language that we're using around the diaspora. Which diaspora are we talking about? And is it going to behoove us to talk more collectively? Because we have advocacy organizations that are supposed to be doing this work, or that do this work of the greater diaspora, been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But we probably don't have the organizations that you are referring to, who are not organized doing the work of the more recent diaspora.
So one thing I would say is that this came up several times when we were writing the executive order for the president to sign on this council, was how do we define the word diaspora? And it came up several times, and everyone has a different opinion. But I think it's in our best interest to define diaspora with an inclusive perspective, right? As Mel has been saying, African Americans and African immigrants. And so, but there are going to be organizations that have a recent African immigrant focus, and that's okay. And there are going to be some that have, I think, a focus that's much more broader, and that's okay. I think the key is how can we work collectively, how can we work together for a greater good to really leverage the source of strength that we have in the diaspora when it comes to our geopolitical framework. We've talked about China, talked about Russia. We have an African diaspora, and I think that when we come together and when we're unified, that's the strength and the advantage that we have when it comes to some of our competitors, quite frankly. And in our U.S. Africa foreign policy space, we talk a lot about this. And that's one of the reasons why we were able to get the president to sign an executive order on this topic in particular. But it's important that we focus more on unifying the diaspora as opposed to defining the different elements of it, because then we get into a conversation that can sometimes be a bit divisive.
Absolutely.
One thing I would say, though, I agree with you totally, Deniece. I see myself as an African born in America. I'm an African, period. And I confuse a lot of the African immigrants because I speak Amharic, I speak Tigrinya. You know, I've been to maybe 45 African countries. You know, what is the definition of African? But I would say that there's also competition and there's also intentional fragmentation. There are forces in here who don't want African Americans and African immigrants to know each other. So a lot of the African immigrants who are brought to this country, they get trained out in Nebraska, Oral Roberts, go to Montana, you'll see some African from Ghana or somewhere. And they don't put them in Maryland, they don't put them near African Americans. And so many of them who are brought to Washington to work in the bureaucracy and so forth, they move them way out by Gaithersburg, they move them way out in Springfield. They need to have an airplane just to fly into Washington. And so part of this, again, we work against our own interests as a country. We pit each other against each other. You know, there was a time when most of the black people, the Africans working in the U.S. administration, and I'm old enough to know this, were African American. Now go and look at the numbers, they're completely reversed, and there's not the synergy between this diaspora. So there needs to be a lot of work in terms of how do we harness this diaspora, how do we get us to work together in a unified fashion? And again, we can't leave others out because everybody is from Africa. We should be trying to get the Hispanics, the Jews, the Irish, everybody else, because we all are African at the end of the day. And what makes America great, or what's supposed to make America great, is this whole thing about we're all immigrants. Now you put that out in the political process and you'll get eaten alive. But the reality is the best thing that can make America great, and this ain't Donald Trump speaking, the best thing that can make America great is that we figure out a way to build this truly as a melting pot where the benefits for all of us as Americans, vote for me and I'll set you free.
Well, okay, so we have just a couple of minutes left. Is there any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Hello, yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Charles Shima. I am from Vancouver in Canada via Kigali, Rwanda. One of the most beautiful countries.
Thank me, huh?
Wow, I loved everything you were saying. Loaded question. So I've lived in Canada for the last 25 years, right? And I left Rwanda when I was just 16. And now I am coming here because what I'm finding in the global African diaspora is the disconnect, right? We don't talk to each other as we should. Like, I'm from Canada and then I have to come here. And so one of my first questions is, how do we solve the divide? Because I built Deniece, which is an Afrocentric travel marketplace. So in the travel and the tourism, and also speaking for the last 5 years about the beautiful continent of Africa. If you go follow me on LinkedIn, you can see that. I hear firsthand, and I can see the divide. And yes, we hustle, and the money talks, and there's so many things. So that's my first question. How do we solve the divide? Another question I have is to do with this thinking. And don't get me wrong, Mr. Beast, which even before he went to build the water, I was actually speaking about him. It's just that the first thought that people have about our continent with those who don't know, is two things. It's not safe, or the Africans are hungry. I mean, 54 countries, yeah? So let's go save them, rather than let's go invest in the continent. So how do we flip that? Because I hear that all the time where I am, where people don't want to, fund us, but don't come and save us. We are okay, we can save ourselves. You know what I mean? So, those are my two questions, and thank you.
So I'll say this. So the New York Times recently ran a series, and I think their first article started with "The world is becoming African." And I think it's completely true. And that New York Times series, every statistics sort of outlined in that series, every story and every narrative on that series is impactful. And I think that we have to do a better job owning the narrative, sharing the narrative, and distributing the narrative about Africa to really change some of those perspectives that you mentioned. But the world is truly becoming more African. We all know the statistics with the youth bulge, with the population increase. And so as we see this growth on the continent, I think for anything, it comes with possibilities and peril, but we have to leverage the possibilities, right? And take advantage of those opportunities that exist as the world truly is becoming more African.
It's a great question. I think this perennial problem of saying, Africa is the place that needs a donation and investment is something that folks have been trying to solve for a long time. I think the way you do that is through clear, concise data. I mean, the one thing that doesn't have an opinion is math and numbers, right? And so when you go and you share about the growth in the population, when you share about the potential economic growth that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will create, the market opportunity, the growth of innovation and technology. I mean, when you share those numbers, right, those credible numbers, I think that's how you begin to change the narrative. But it's hard to do that without a clear and defined data set.
I got a real quick one. I just want to say we need to be actually trying to unify. We try to, everything that we do programmatically, we try to make sure there's African immigrants in the room, African Americans in the room, Afro-Caribbean in the room, 40%, at least 40% are gender balanced women. Make sure there's some young people in the room. Make sure that there's some old heads in the room. We try to do it through our programming. We call it the African American Unity Caucus. And we try to do that every time we put something together. We try to make sure the diaspora is working together. We think that that's one way of trying to reach it. And we're doing the same thing with our Canadian brothers and sisters. We're promoting a unified front. Get the leaders to unify. I think the masses will follow. But we have to bring the unit. This is where we need the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, Atlantic Council, and others to help us to resource to bring together the unification of the African diaspora.
So I'll just say the last thing. This is what we're doing at Howard, is building these relationships, making sure our students are getting to not only Africa, but Latin America, where Brazil has the largest population of black people outside of the continent. Colombia, huge black population, but we don't ever talk about these things. So imagine if we were able to connect the diaspora in the US, the diaspora in Latin America with the continent, and do it successfully, the impact that that could have. But there are powers that be that don't want to let that happen. But we're working on that. And the other thing is language. We as Americans must do a much better job of learning other languages. We not expect everyone to learn English. So making sure that our students are enrolled in language classes, and that number is going down. So anyway, that's a whole other topic of conversation. I'll save that for another time. I want to thank the panelists for your wonderful insight, and Atlantic Council and DAI for the invitation. Thank you so much.